Hello, everyone. I'm Professor Stephen Pimper, and I run the Public Service and Nonprofit Leadership Program at the University of New Hampshire. And in the next 20 minutes or so, I want to think through with you what the last year or so might teach us about social welfare policy, about the state of our politics, and about how we might think about approaching our efforts to make the U.S. a more hospitable place for more people. So let's start by going back to March 27th, 2020, and the passage of the first emergency COVID relief bill, the CARES Act. Now, policy historians write about the two big bangs of U.S. welfare state development, and usually they mean the New Deal programs of the 1930s and the Great Society programs of the 1960s. And you might run across others talking about these moments as critical junctures. So the question I've been thinking about is, could March 2020 and the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic have marked the beginning of a third Big Bang? Did we enter another critical juncture in our political and policy history? Now keep in mind, right, in that month alone, so much of what for years we had been told could not be done was done almost overnight. Congress enacted a national paid sick leave policy, although a temporary one, ending our status finally as the only rich democracy without one. They instituted a national emergency unemployment program to supplement the state-run plans, and it was a generous one at that, relatively, sending an additional $600 per week to people who could not work and expanding the definition of people who were eligible, and then they expanded it at $300 a week at the end of the year. They suspended student loan payments for 6 months and later extended that for an even longer period and authorized the federal government to send a cash payment of up to $1,200 per adult and $500 per child to almost every family in the country, and then did it again later for half the amount and then once more after that for even more money. These initiatives were so bold that household income overall actually rose and poverty rates declined, even though at the same time the most comprehensive official unemployment measure exceeded 20%. Meanwhile, states eased their eligibility for their own unemployment insurance programs. They suspended work requirements for Medicaid and for SNAP, that's what we used to call food stamps, expanded SNAP eligibility, increased benefit levels, created emergency funds to support daycare facilities, opened up new shelter spaces for people who were experiencing homelessness, and released people who had been incarcerated for trivial offenses or who had served a significant percentage of their sentence. Nonviolent offenders were issued warnings instead of being arrested. Governments encouraged or even required their localities to suspend evictions and to eliminate penalties for late property tax payments. They directed public utilities not to cut off water or power for people who fell behind on their bills, and they advised local authorities to equip the local camps that were set up by homeless people with portable bathrooms and with washing stations. Many cities reconfigured their public spaces and made more of it close to cars and available to pedestrians, to cyclists, to diners, and to children at play. At the same time, businesses raised workers' wages, although often making sure to note that the increases were temporary, while people started to earnestly thank grocery store clerks and delivery people and healthcare workers for their service, just as we had previously done for veterans of the U.S. Armed Forces. In some cities, people experiencing homelessness claimed and occupied vacant, abandoned properties that were owned by the city and were permitted to do so. We saw a smattering of strikes by frontline service and delivery workers spreading throughout the country, causing yet more businesses to raise their wages, to provide protective equipment, and to promise to create safer working conditions. And in what may be one of the greatest acts of mass solidarity of the era, untold millions of us remain sequestered in our homes in order to stop the spread of the disease and to protect our neighbors from illness or death. Now, to be sure, even this crisis wasn't enough to get Congress to enact the more radical proposals that were before them in those early months, like a permanent national unemployment insurance program guaranteeing that people receive 100% of their former wages, or abolition of student loan debt, or a nationwide permanent rent and mortgage moratorium, expanded access to Medicaid and Medicare, or stricter occupational health and safety regulations for the most at-risk workers. Keep in mind that farm workers and meat processing plants employees, many of whom were undocumented, continued to feed the nation while they were ineligible for any of the expanded relief programs. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, continued to imprison immigrants and refugees, kidnapping and then losing track of their children in the process. And even with state, county, and municipal action, by mid-year of 2020, the COVID-19 death rate for prisoners was 5.5 times higher than the overall rate. And by May of 2020, right, that sense of urgency and of solidarity that seemed to have left Washington, even though more than 100,000 people had already been officially counted among the dead at that point. But then something happened. Yet another black man was killed by the police. His name was George Floyd this time. And a massive wave of sustained protests swept throughout the nation, inspiring comparisons to the so-called unrest of the 1960s and generating concern among some that the U.S. was slipping into irredeemable chaos. Now, as has historically been the case, much of the violence that occurred was actually instigated by agents of the state, not those who were protesting the aggressively racist practices of those institutions. But in response to those events, states and localities started what in many cases were serious conversations about reducing the portion of their budgets allocated to police forces, and defund the police became a rallying cry. Citizens toppled statues and defaced monuments erected to the Confederacy, and many finally came to recognize the Confederate battle flag as an inherently racist symbol. NASCAR and the U.S. Navy even banned its display. These were the largest sustained mass protests the U.S. has seen since the peak of the Black rights movements of the 1960s, and quite possibly the largest throughout our entire history. And that's another extraordinary instance of mass solidarity. Now, as is common during these moments of crisis, bad actors will also seize them. So, the Trump administration used the pandemic, the economic crisis, and outrage over racist state violence as cover for doing things like rolling back environmental protections, accelerating anti-immigrant policies and border closures, firing oversight officials who were perceived as hostile to their autocratic impulses or who were impeding their efforts to profit from the crisis. And they continued efforts to corrupt the decennial census, to delegitimize absentee voting methods, and to undermine the 2020 election, engaging in increasingly aggressive efforts to suppress speech, assault protesters, culminating in the deployment of armed federal troops to stir unrest in largely democratic cities, and voicing increasing support for right-wing terrorists who even in some instances murdered protesters. Many came to worry about rising authoritarianism and so-called democratic backsliding, concerns that, of course, attained new weight as Trump waged a sustained coup effort after having lost to President Biden. And while his defeat ratcheted down the immediate threat, the risk remains. It's a lot, right? I think we have not fully appreciated just how much history has been made in the past year. And of course, right, the CARES Act was just the beginning. The follow-up bill from December of 2020 extended the life of many of those programs and even added in yet more new ones. And then we get to the first such bill under the Biden administration and the new Democratic majorities, which was even arguably more dramatic, right? That new law sent what, $1,400 cash to every family with income under $75,000, extended the federal unemployment insurance program, expanded subsidies to those who were buying insurance under the Affordable Care Act, fully subsidized COBRA subsidies, that's people who buy health insurance when they leave their employment, created new incentives for states to expand Medicaid, expanded eligibility for the particular part of the Medicaid program that is eligible to women who have just given birth. It expanded rental and mortgage assistance and Section 8 housing programs, increased STAP benefits by 15%, expanded eligibility for WIC and those benefits, expanded the universal free lunch program, tripled the earned income tax benefit for childhood adults, created an expanded child tax credit that will start sending $3,600 a year to every household with a child under 6 and $3,000 a year for every child age 6 to 17 in monthly payments, possibly starting as soon as summer of 2021. And more and more. There was $350 billion in aid to states and localities, $130 billion for aid to K through 12 education, another $40 billion for higher ed, the single largest ever one-time investments in K through 12 education in all of our history. Another $100 billion into public health, $50 billion to transportation, again, and on and on and on. Among the short-term effects of these programs, it is possible by the summer of 2021 that we will have cut U.S. child poverty in half, cut overall poverty by a third, and cut Black and Hispanic poverty in half. The poorest 20% of the U.S. population will likely see a 20% increase in their after-tax income, and the next poorest 20%, a 10% increase in their after-tax income. We may well lift as many as 20 million people above the poverty line. And there's more to come, with the American Jobs Plan now, as we speak, working its way through Congress. So here's that larger question, right? What does all of this tell us about U.S. politics and policymaking? Do these extraordinary events confirm what we thought we knew about politics and power in the U.S., or do they require that we rethink our assumptions, right? And most important, or at least to me most important, what are the lessons that people working with and for marginalized populations, what are the lessons that they can take away from this extended series of crises that will help them advocate for and enact policies to improve the well-being of the people and places they care about, right? Or put more succinctly, what are the strategic lessons from 2020 that will help you fight successfully for change into the future? So let me highlight just a few. First lesson for me is that remember that overnight change, so-called overnight change, often comes from decades worth of hard work and organizing. Right? The child tax credit that I just talked about briefly is something that U.S. House Representative Rosa DeLauro has been fighting for almost 2 decades. She has been slogging away with many of her colleagues, trying to change the debate and waiting for an opportunity to enact her carefully crafted policy proposals. Even in a moment of emergency, that policy making is only available to be adopted because of the people who have been working tirelessly over the long haul, like Representative Rosa DeLauro, right? I would suggest that without the work that she's been doing slowly and quietly over a long period of time, we may not well have had that child tax credit. Second, a lot of the things that we've been told for so long were just impossible turn out not to be impossible at all. We may be in the midst of a fundamental transformation in U.S. social policy and in how we think about what government can and should do. But that change, if it continues, will not happen by magic. All the more reason to keep pushing for the things that you think are important. Seize this moment of expanded opportunity and hopefulness. Third, never underestimate the power that we all have when we act together in public acts of defiance. Movements matter. And there was arguably no important advance in U.S. social, political, or economic policy that does not have mass protest and disruption at its center. Fourth, one of the things that the novel coronavirus pandemic has taught us is that there is no such thing as a natural disaster. It wasn't a disaster for everyone, remember, right? Many people who could work from home, for example, actually saw their financial status improve. They kept their jobs and their income, but their expenses declined. Crises like this one reveal existing fissures in the fabric of our society and the flaws in our social support systems. But that's also the opportunity it created for us too, right? It allows us to see more clearly the work that needs to be done to help ensure that more of us are more secure and able to withstand the next crisis. Right? Related to that, I like to think that maybe we have learned some lessons about the ways in which people who do the most vital work are often the least valued, right? We could change that. We could take that lesson to heart. Sixth, partisan polarization structures everything now at the national level and increasingly at the state level too. And any effort at systemic change needs to think about what this means and how you account for it. Seventh, we have, I hope, over this extended crisis, been reminded that competent and well-resourced government matters. And we must invest in and reward dedicated, effective public service. Finally, the coronavirus pandemic was a preview on a small scale of the disruptions that's surely to come from climate change if we do not act boldly and aggressively. But we don't need to despair, even though the challenge of that is massive. Big, fast, smart change is possible. That, I think, may be the single most important lesson to take away from 2020 and 2021. All right, I will stop there and I will leave you with two final suggestions. First is my presentation from last year on how to think about effectively engaging in politics and policy advocacy is linked to on the conference website. If you're so inclined, take a look at that, since I think those lessons are still relevant too. And then second, I hope very much that you'll join me for one or even both of our live sessions to ask questions and also to share your own thoughts and ideas about what we can do to seize this historic moment to improve the well-being of the populations that we care about. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope that you enjoy your conference.